conference titled
Nothing About Us Without Us.
How one group of disability rights advocates fought for recognition
by forcing the government to accept responsibility for discrimination.
On April 5th, 1977, activists for disability rights decided to take matters into their own hands. They made their way to the 4th floor of the Health, Education, and Welfare Building in San Francisco. It would become the longest occupation of a federal building in American history.
We were loud and clear that if Section 504 was not signed by April 5th, we would take action.
And when April 5th came and went, we, the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities, decided to protest in 10 different cities across the United States.
Including San Francisco.
What made 120 people enter a federal building with the intent to stay no matter what?
Frustration. 4 years of waiting for Section 504 to be signed. 4 years government delays because enacting the act, which was the first protection for people with disabilities,
was expensive and difficult and would require sweeping change.
So, the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, Joseph Califano, launched a committee to review the Rehabilitation Act,
which weakened the act,
made it less like integration and more like
separate but equal. When we first entered the federal building, the workers there thought it was a joke. They gave us cookies and punch like we were on a field trip.
I don't think they understood how serious we were. We weren't going anywhere.
Let's just say, we brought our toothbrushes. For centuries, people with disabilities have been denied basic human rights, such as
education,
employment,
and the ability to participate freely in society.
The 1977 Section 504 sit-in in San Francisco,
With its persistent pressure on government officials,
highlighted the government's responsibility to ensure equal rights for all citizens.
it resulted in groundbreaking changes,
including pivotal legal protections for individuals in the disability community.
numerous long overdue enhancements in accessibility,
and the profound effect of transforming society's perception of individuals with disabilities.
Additionally, the Section 504 sit-in played a role in the enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which furthered protections for people with disabilities.
In the 18th century, rights for those with disabilities was practically non-existent.
The National Park Service noted that caring for people with disabilities was often a town's responsibility. It provided poor farms and almshouses to support those in need.
Individuals with disabilities, criminals, and paupers, along with mentally ill patients, were often placed under one roof in dirty, overcrowded places.
Thanks to much reform work, conditions slowly started to improve in the 19th century. However, it was still far from adequate.
It wasn't until after World War I, when veterans with disabilities returned home, that disability legislation began to gain footing.
there was limited progress in the early 19th century due to major historical events such as the Great Depression and World War II.
By 1964, the Civil Rights Act had been passed, which outlawed discrimination based on race, religion, sex, and national origin in public accommodations and employment. However, it excluded discrimination based on disability.
Disability advocates saw this as an opportunity to unite with other minority groups to demand equal access, treatment, and opportunities.
Parent advocates led the charge, calling for their children to be removed from institutions and asylums.
They demanded that their children be sent to schools where they were able to participate on an equal basis with their peers.
Finally, in 1968, the Architectural Barriers Act was passed, widely considered the first federally passed legislation solely for those with disabilities.
This act mandates all federally constructed buildings and institutions, such as courthouses and prisons, be accessible for everyone.
For the first time, people with disabilities had a legal guarantee of access to many public buildings. In the 1970s, Judy Heumann became a prominent leader for disabled rights.
I won a lawsuit against the New York City Board of Education for denying me teaching license. They claimed my wheelchair was a fire hazard in the classroom. After this, I co-founded the organization Disabled in Action. We primarily work through political activism and protest to raise awareness for disability rights issues.
Ed Roberts, an activist who had developed polio at 14, was also making a name for himself in California.
I helped establish the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley. We were one of the first organizations to advocate for self-sufficiency and community integration for people with disabilities.
Heumann and Roberts, along with the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities, or the ACCD, would continue to push for systematic change in the nation, and their efforts would pay off.
Most notably, we played a role in the passage of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, organizing protests after its veto from President Nixon, who openly opposed the act.
Their supporters would have the American public believe that each of these bills would further an important social cause, but they neglect to warn the public that simply throwing money at problems does not solve anything.
Despite its concerns with the act's importance, the Rehabilitation Act was signed. People with disabilities were relieved because they were now legally protected from discrimination.
While the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was a step in the right direction, there was little to no implementation by the government after they signed it.
Section 504, which was a part of the Rehabilitation Act, expanded requirements to combat discrimination against people with disabilities.
Section 504 remarks that
No otherwise qualified individual with a disability in the United States shall solely by reason of her or his disability be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance.
In the words of Corbett O'Toole, a participant in the sit-in, that one sentence felt like freedom.
The programs or activities outlined in Section 504 were public schools, universities, solely owned and government-owned businesses, and public transportation.
It prevented doctors, employers, and schools from refusing individuals with disabilities.
If this section of the act was implemented, the lives of countless people would change forever.
Suddenly, disability rights activists all across America shared one common goal.
Get Section 504 signed.
When April 5th passed and Section 504 was still not signed, sit-ins began across the nation. Judy Heumann, along with activists Ed Roberts, Kitty Cohn, and Brad Lomax, led the most notable sit-in.
Where the ACCD and many other volunteers camped inside the HEW building in San Francisco for nearly a month.
Hello everyone, my name is Kitty Cohn and this is Judy Heumann. Thank you all for coming to participate in the sit-in. We were not expecting more than 100 of you to show up. We have a better chance at Califano signing the regulations with you all here.
Getting the regulations signed would mean we no longer be discriminated against. Our rights to go to school where we want and get jobs we want must be recognized.
It didn't take long for the HEW to catch wind that the protesters were not just visiting.
We will stay in here for as long as it takes to get what we deserve.
We've been seen as childlike and helpless for far too long, not the kind of people who fought back. Today that changes.
To get the supplies, they needed to stay in the building for nearly a month. Deaf protesters inside signed to activists outside, telling them what was needed.
Okay everyone, I was able to communicate with some of our people outside. Looks like we'll be able to get the supplies we need to stay in here for quite a while.
It seems that we're gaining momentum. We've been here for 4 days now, and we're finally receiving national attention.
Without the support from all the people outside the building, the protests would not have been able to go on for as long as it did.
On the 15th of April, 11 days into the sit-in, a congressional meeting was held to address the reasoning behind the protest. Judy Heumann was the first to speak.
I can tell you that every time you raise an issue, Start Pepper Equal, the outrage of disabled individuals across this country will continue. We will no longer allow the government to oppress us. We want the law enforced.
One by one, speaker after speaker told of years spent trying to get a job, education, and their feelings of pain and isolation.
At the end, with tears in his eyes, Congressman Burton said,
I do not believe there's a person in this room who's not standing 10 feet taller because of today.
The supporters were sure they would hear something from Robert Califano, who is the head of the HEW offices, but they heard nothing. The day after the hearing, the sit-in leaders met to discuss a response.
As primary representatives of the protesters, Judy and I would travel to Washington to meet with the president in Califano on a trip funded by the United Auto Workers Union.
But first, a delegation would have to meet with Stuart Eisenstadt, President Carter's domestic affairs advisor, who would not accept responsibility for Califano's refusal to sign the regulations.
We, the domestic policy staff, coordinate to ensure the legislation we propose is consistent with the president's policy. We've not gotten involved with regulations before.
In other words, he felt this was an HEW issue, not a presidential issue.
With respect, the disability organization is strong, yet we feel we are being led around by the nose. Non-disabled individuals are telling us they know best.
We're prepared to enforce these regulations. There's millions of people who have never been a part of society, and in order to fix that, we need the backup of these regulations.
The delegates would continue to discuss and defend their civil rights, hoping Eisenstadt would understand their perspective on the importance of signing Section 504.
Hoping to engage the mainstream media in supporting our cause, we sung outside the White House and followed the president and other government officials across the city, demonstrating outside their churches, cafes, and clubs.
And on Thursday, April 28th, Robert Califano finally gave in and signed the regulations for Section 504.
Victory!
It was the 24th day of the sit-in. The protesters occupied the building for 2 more days. They left hugging and triumphantly singing, "We shall overcome."
in the aftermath of the signing of Section 504, the biggest challenge to us proved to be the enforcement.
Any federally funded business or organization was required to accommodate those of us with disabilities.
Any instances of discrimination brought about consequences for educational institutions, corporations, and transportation services.
This was a stark contrast from past years when discriminatory action went primarily unpunished.
One of the simplest arguments against change is to say something is too expensive, corrupt, unsafe, or impossible.
The disability advocates and allies understood that to make change, they must be constantly working on solutions to the opposition.
Section 504 was a landmark event that reframed disability as a civil rights issue.
However, it was limited because it only addressed issues of access, when in reality, disability rights involves much more than just equal access for everyone.
Today, the disability justice movement utilizes an intersectional approach to accommodations, recognizing the interconnectedness of race, age, gender, class, and disability. Section 504 ultimately led to further changes including
Legal protections,
Section 504 mandates all federally constructed buildings accommodate people with disabilities, leading to equal access to education, employment, and transportation.
accessibility improvements,
ramps, curb cutouts, and other accommodations became commonplace.
and a shift in societal attitudes.
After Section 504 was signed, there was greater acceptance and inclusion of people with disabilities.
The sit-in demonstrated the power of advocacy and the government's responsibility to ensure equality for all of its citizens.
Section 504 and subsequent acts paved the way for the Americans with Disabilities Act, further expanding the rights and protections for people with disabilities.
Today, most of society still views people with disabilities as an idea in their head and not as real people.
Corbett O'Toole described it perfectly.
They don't think people in wheelchairs do anything except exist in a sign on a parking space that they wish they had.
They are not just a symbol on a sign. They are real people who deserve to live how they want without any restrictions.
And it's time that we as a society
Accept responsibility for making sure they can.